I heard the dessert is too good, so I had to go take a bite. But I think others followed the lead. I should have just probably just snuck in through that door. But if you're coming through that door, please find another person, another friend of yours, and get them inside. I know the discussions over lunch could just go on, and these two are the very tough times between this and the next break. So as everyone trickles in, a little bit of background on. If you go to the next one, the next panel. What's that? Want us now? A little bit. I'm waiting for a couple of folks to show up, maybe from inside. So this particular panel is going to be a very, I would say, impactful in terms of the actual work that gets done. From the industry work, I know we do quite a few things from directly commercial industry side, but the public-private partnership, especially the global public-private partnership, is the I think the most impactful. Supporting Afghan Afghan evacuation, then subsequently going into the Ukraine effort. All of this had come to us, and we were reactive again to kind of support, knowing or understanding what we can and cannot do. But as the role of cyber becomes more and more emphatic in securing countries and societies, US and our allies and our partners, this North American infrastructure we have within US, Canada, we are still in a position to defend ourselves. But think about our smaller nations and allies that don't have that capacity, don't even have the experience. I mean, forget the infrastructure, do this. And that's where this panel's focus is, in making sure that we are able to extend the resources, our learning, and the infrastructure they have put together to go into a more proactive support of these nations. I would not go into the depth of this. I would let the panel come and discuss. So probably start with Maggie as the moderator, as we invite Tom Callahan, Janet Jervis, and Steph Sample to come in and shed light on this, and also kind of guide us through this process, because this is something that the cyber industry is not very experienced in, right? If you think about the defense industry, there is a supply chain and there is a operational element, but cyber industry needs your help and guidance to get this through. So thank you, and please join this session.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maggie McDonough. I am here speaking to you on behalf of the Purdue Applied Research Institute. You heard from my colleague Joel Rasmus during a couple of other panels, who heads our inter and cross-disciplinary cybersecurity center on campus. I am with a newer entity on campus, which really focuses on bringing the breadth of Purdue's research and learning and innovation capabilities into global development and national security. So my caveat here is that I am not a trained cyber person. I am more of an international development person, but happy to be here sort of facilitating a discussion around cyber in smaller nations. Putting on my academic hat for a moment, we know that there is a lot of research that has come out showing the link between digital transformation and global development. We know that it can catalyze economic development. We know that digital can increase access to healthcare. It can increase transparency in public institutions. It can improve service delivery. It can strengthen education systems, etc. Unfortunately, I think the flip side of that is that the donor community has not paid enough attention to defending the digital systems that they're set up. And I think as a result of that, we are seeing an increasing amount of cyber attacks, particularly in smaller and developing nations. I think from what we've seen, cyber warfare is increasingly attractive to bad actors. This isn't unique to smaller nations, but smaller nations have their own sets of issues that sort of come along with defending themselves, which we'll talk about a little bit in this panel. But looking over the course of, even just the past year, we've seen some pretty devastating attacks in places from Vanuatu to Costa Rica to Tonga to Guam. The Vanuatu example has been particularly devastating, as the country is still trying to recover from it almost a year later. So in this panel, we're really going to, be focusing on some of those issues and opportunities relating to cyber defense of smaller nations. And I think to start off, I'd like to ask the panelists to introduce themselves. We're excited to have such an esteemed panel of people as part of this discussion. So Steph, if you could start us off.
Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Steph Shample. I am here today on behalf of two organizations. I am a senior analyst at Dark Owl. We're on the dark web. We follow the cybercrime, their infrastructure and ecosystems. In addition, I am fortunate enough to be a part of CDAC, which Tom also is. And you guys all know what CDAC does. We have been interfacing and liaising with Ukraine, of course, since the invasion. So that's what I'm here representing. I got my start. I am former Army. I was a linguist. I went to the Defense Language Institute in California. I did nothing with cyber 20 years ago, absolutely nothing. I separated from the Army after 2 deployments, which was wonderful. I mean that sincerely. My time in Afghanistan was the best time of my life. I really mean that. I went to the DoD, as so many do. I was caught up in the OPM breach. So Russia and China have the information. So I am former NSA. I'm very open about that because it's already global. So I had a wonderful decade at the NSA, learned so much. I did counterterrorism, counter narcotics, counter human trafficking, counter proliferation. And then Iran got online. So they took everybody who could speak a foreign language and said, can you help us? What are they saying? What are these chat forums? What are you doing? And I walked in day one and said, what is leet speak? Like, what is this person trying to say, right? I had no clue what I was doing. So to all of the discussions we've had starting Sunday night, where you don't have to be a programmer, a coder, a computer science, an engineer to be in this realm, I'm living proof of that. I really couldn't do anything with a computer as of like 15 years ago. So let me tell you that there is hope and that diverse and divergent thinking is very, very necessary. I then went to the private industry when I realized that a lot of people were starting to, thanks to cyber and thanks to technology. I left the government in 2019, and I have been at several companies since then, following actors, translating, briefing on TTPs, IOCs, and then was thankful, and I am thankful, and I'm very lucky enough to be at the 2 organizations I'm with now. So with that, I'll pass it to Tom.
Does anyone else just want to hear from Steph for the rest of the hour? I do. Like Steph, I also am a veteran of the OPM breach. Thank you very much. I'm with CRDF Global. I've been there about 4 years. I'm kind of in senior advisor status at this point. But prior to that, I've worked in the State Department. I've worked in the Congress, both on the House and the Senate side. Most recently, 2017 to 19, with a portfolio on political, military, security assistance, counterterrorism, that kind of arms sales, that kind of thing. And before that, a lot of Africa focus in other areas. The fun fact, I guess, with, one of the things that I share with some of the people in this room is a lot of international travel and so forth. This is the first time I've been to Ottawa, and boy, I like it. So thank you, Cyber Future Foundation, for hosting it here this time around.
Are you saying you like it better than Somalia, Tom?
Somalia it's an acquired taste, but there are those who love it, and I'm one of them.
Hi, this is Jeanette again. I'm going to keep it brief since I was introduced on a panel earlier today, but I started my career, as you know, at Boeing, and then I moved over to the cybersecurity vendor side, Microsoft, McAfee, Fortinet, and while at McAfee, I helped create the Cyber Threat Alliance, where I am now, and I'm going to talk more about it. That's one of the questions, so I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jeanette. I want to start out with a question for all three of you to reflect on, which is, what are some of the unique sort of challenges that are faced by smaller nations when it comes to their own cyber defense? I don't care who goes first. Whoever wants to, just jump in.
You know, when I look at things in the cyber industry, I look at it a lot from the CTA point of view. How can we better share information to better protect governments, nations, end users, just the world, really? And one of the biggest challenges with small nations is resources and the capabilities. They just don't have it. We need to think about more in a sophisticated manner how we can work with organizations that aren't equipped to be state of the art, who are behind in a lot of ways. I was going to use an example of a country that did something really cool years ago. And then I got online to figure out what year it was, and I saw that they were just hacked in July. But let me tell you about it. I was sharing a talk at a conference a number of years ago, and the speaker was from Kenya, and the Kenya government website had been hacked. And so this gentleman was tasked with going out and figuring out what they need to do to build better security into their infrastructure. And it was very encouraging to see him there in an environment like this, where there's security professionals, for him to network with, chat, learn, figure it all out. That's what small nations need to be doing. That's what anybody needs to be doing, by all means. But I was very disappointed when I Googled them earlier and found out they were just hacked in July. So what can you say? But, you know, resources is the biggest challenge, and we need to be able to step in. That's why CDAC, I think, is so important. Is, you know, there's a lot of really credible, smart people who are willing to help. And so this is an industry of open arms, really. So that's my point of view.
The session we had where you talked about the board book and how to speak to your board. The equivalent of it would be, how do you speak to your president? How do you speak to your parliament? How do you speak to your Congress about cybersecurity? Because it's, you know, it's more than technical, it's leadership. It's, you know, understanding risk. I mean, part of what was going through my mind in that other session was, you know, presidents of companies are responsible. They have fiduciary responsibility to their stockholders or their private owners. And, you know, if you've got a CISO in front of you saying, you got to buy everything, you know, they're going to, that's their job, is sometimes to say no, or to prioritize elsewhere. That's part of what being a CEO is. Being a president of a country, you know, is figuring out how to use your revenue. And I think that there are a lot of leaders across the world who, like many of us, have a very sketchy understanding of the risks that are out there. And even if they have a pretty good understanding of the risks that are out there today, as we've seen, you know, a year from now, those risks can be compounded. So in terms of, you know, the question, I do think that having a intentional, ongoing level of engagement at the state to state level, backed up by implementers from the private sector and the academic community and the NGOs, with the credibility to say, you know, to a consumer, even if that consumer is a nation state, you know, here's where you're most vulnerable. Let's focus on this first. You know, instead of saying, well, you know, you're toast if you don't do everything. Well, we don't have the money to do everything. Okay, but here's an informed, technically communicable way of reducing your risk while you build your capabilities to a higher level.
In full agreement with everyone on the panel, absolutely. And then I think smaller nations face almost analysis paralysis, right? One giant is going to come in and say, fix your infrastructure. Another one's going to come in and say, tear your infrastructure down, rebuild from the beginning. Another's going to say, do you have backups, right? So they don't have expansive resources, and they don't have tons of time to make the decisions that all of these giant corporations or people or experts are coming in and telling them to do, because they are so much smaller. And furthermore, if you're a small country trying to retain or gain a place on the world stage, what about your sovereignty, right? If Canada comes in, or if the US comes in, or the UK, are they going to take over your networks? Are they going to do something that they shouldn't? So they're trying to do what's right for their people, their population, their government, their industries as a small nation. And they also have to worry about that in addition to what decision do I make first? So it's not an enviable position to be in at all, but you do have to kind of weed out, have the conversations with industry, academia, governments, and who does have your best interest, much like you do as a small nation. Who has that in mind, which is, I think, where I would go.
A question for you, given your long history and background dealing with a lot of the parts of U.S. government and policy at the policy level, how do you see the cyber threat? How does that sort of size up to some of the other national security threats that we've seen over the decades?
I mean, one of the things that, first of all, I think it is rising in prominence. And, I would point to the Solarium Commission that was chaired by Senator Angus King, and I forget the other, but one of the things about that cyber-focused commission is that there's a lot of good blue ribbon panels out there, a lot of good think tanks, a lot of good work. What that had among its commissioners were active sitting members of Congress and the Senate. And so some of the recommendations that came out of the think tank report, we've seen migrate into law, usually through amendments to the National Defense Authorization Act and other areas. And that's a big difference. And I think on that legislative side, Langolin was one of the commissioners. He's retiring there, but like Todd Young, Senator Young was a big proponent of the ITSE part of the CHIPS Act. ITSE is International Technology Security and Innovation. I mean, it's a $500 million over 5-year fund to help improve partner nations ICT. It's kind of the anti-Huawei thing, but broader than that. And they've recently created within the Department of State a new bureau, the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy. It's headed up by Nate Fick. Some of you might know him from Endgame. Nate was also the president of Center for New American Security. He's former Marine. He wrote a book about the entry into Iraq when he was a Marine Force Recon. And then, as I mentioned yesterday, I think the National Cybersecurity Strategy that the Biden administration put out recently is, I think, an advance in the nature of these strategies, in that, from my perspective, it has an entire pillar devoted to forging international partnerships and actively helping foreign, entities. So I think, in the dumpster fire that is international security policy, it's got a profile. But these kind of long lead time things that require a lot of collaboration and a lot of breakdown of existing silos, they tend to take a back burner when you've got a immediate threat, whether it's domestic politics, or an indictment, or whatever, like these things. I mean, I rely on what some have pejoratively called the deep state. I rely on the deep state to keep this stuff moving along. And that can only be helped by private sector organizations who are saying, yeah, no, this is important. And we can't do our job protecting the US homeland if everything's a dumpster fire outside our borders. And that's true of viruses and biosecurity. That's true of cybersecurity. That's true of a lot of things.
Thanks, Tom. Steph, I'm interested in, through the work that you're doing, what types of things are you seeing, in terms of, how this sort of cyber warfare is manifesting on a day-to-day level as it relates to smaller nations?
Absolutely. I don't think anything of what we're seeing, myself and my team with hands on keyboard, is different from what the ISACs industry, government, military, everybody that has participated in convos in this room are seeing. I did write them down, though, because there's so much and they're so much overlap and interplay, and I didn't want to miss anything. So a small nation does not mean they're lacking for connectivity. This is IoT, this is smart devices in the home. We just heard about automobiles. And then furthermore, in smaller nations, take El Salvador, Afghanistan developing, medium-sized maybe, Equatorial Guinea, right? All of these nations access the internet via their smartphones. So you've got everybody from a toddler to your grandmother on the cell phone, accessing the internet, not really familiar with security because the country itself doesn't have policies and standards yet, right? They're still developing. So that connectivity means everybody's a risk. And that is, of course, lending to expansion in the attack surface, which means anybody can get in at any point. It only takes one weak link, right? So that's what we're seeing there. And the lack of policies, again, that's hopefully something that can be addressed. The second thing is probably hacktivism has really stepped up. So no longer are you just going to face maybe a funny image or a silly web page with a phrase. You're going to actually face people who want to take down critical infrastructure of your nation, your small nation, because you took a stance on something, right? Whether you defended Afghanistan or defended the Taliban, defended Russia, defended the Western powers, defended Ukraine, whatever, you're putting yourself at risk as a smaller nation to open yourself up to hacktivism. And we're seeing that with groups that went after NATO, SiegeSec, where, NATO is not critical infrastructure, but still the point stands. Belarus, the people who are anti-Lukashenko are going after and derailing the railroads, right, for critical infrastructure. So that's hacktivism. And then the third one, which I really don't have to tell anybody in this room, is ransomware. It is everywhere. It is prolific. It is an epidemic. They kind of honed their skills during the pandemic, right? And that's only gotten worse because we have hybrid work now. We still have lagging and lacking security standards, and that's worldwide. That's global. So it is a global issue and one that we definitely need to be aware of. People don't know what they have connected in smaller nations, right? Because everything, the maritime talk I go back to fascinated me yesterday. Cranes have IPs, shipping containers have IPs. So do your toasters. So does, everything is talking to everything else, and it's a risk. And that's very, very true in a small nation, especially when they depend on personal devices, which can then mix in with a corporate or a governmental infrastructure network at that time. So that's kind of what we're seeing for right now.
Thanks. And Jeanette, over to you. I have a two-part question for you. The first question is, I personally think that the story behind your organization and how it formed is really interesting. So part one of the question is if you could talk us through that a little bit. And then the second part of, actually, let me just stop and let you go through that, and then I'll ask the second part of the question.
All right. I did want to make a comment on what you just said, Steph. People in large nations don't know what's connected to the internet. It's a universal problem. Okay, so the Cyber Threat Alliance, I love talking about it because I think what we're doing is really pretty cool. It started in 2014 when two fierce competitors, Palo Alto Networks and Fortinet, decided that they should work together, that they were not competing on the data, that they're competing on their technologies. So they approached us. I was at McAfee, and they came over and chatted with us, and we decided to work with them, as did Symantec. And the four of us initially kicked off this alliance to share threat intelligence. Because what's most important to keep in mind is not everybody, despite what your vendor is going to tell you, has all the data. Every vendor brings something unique to the table. They're not all in the same country. They're not all the same customers. They don't have all the same technologies. They're not competing on the data. So data should be shared, because when data is shared, we're all enriched. We can better tell the story of what the attacker is doing. We can better inform our customers and our products to make them more protected. So to test out this concept of working together with our competitors, we decided to tackle a campaign, and that campaign was CryptoWall 3. And all four of us shared everything we knew about CryptoWall 3, and we published a report not terribly long after. And the day after we published the report, the adversaries took down their infrastructure. So we learned right away that we could make a difference. It was very impactful. Now, I will say that the bad actor did create CryptoWall 4, but It cost more money. It took more time. We were able to make an impact in the short term. And so we thought, why don't we make this broader? So for a couple years, we were working on this on the side of our desks. We all have our day job. So we decided to form a nonprofit to run it as a company, but also to have independent oversight so that no one vendor was perception that they were benefiting more than any other. So in 2017, in January, we launched as an official nonprofit. We're a 501c6 membership association. We hired Michael Daniel, who had just ended his tenure with President Obama's administration. Fantastic CEO. Could not have asked for a better CEO for this role. We now have 36 members headquartered in 12 countries. In fact, half of our members are outside of the US. They're very large vendors to very small vendors. Some of them are cybersecurity organizations, part of telcos, some are MSPs, and then the requirement is that you just are a cybersecurity organization in some aspect. We share around 350,000 IOCs with context every day. You are required to submit context, and you are required to share. So there's no free riders, and you have to meet a certain point requirement. So we're continuing to grow. I would say that if your cybersecurity vendor is not part of the CTA, you need to ask them why. Because our members are going to be better protected because they're getting information that they never would have had otherwise. And we do other things too. For example, we worked with the Japanese Olympic Committee and put out a report about threats against the Olympics. We've done reports on edge computing. You know, we have the capabilities of taking some of the brightest minds in the cybersecurity industry to work together and create an output that's going to benefit everybody. It's really cool. I love what we're doing, and sharing information is critical. If something's happening in Spain, for example, it may be happening next in Chile. We need to understand what the threat landscape looks like in real time so we can be more preventative. And that's what the CTA is trying to do.
I think that was a little bit of a scoop into part 2 of the question, which was also a version of the question that I asked Steph. But what are you seeing from your point of view around challenges to cyber defense in smaller nations?
Well, one of the challenges is, for example, threats against critical infrastructure are continuing to increase. It's a very enticing platform, and it can cause a lot of critical impact. And so threat actors want to go after that. What are we seeing? Well, nation state attacks are very complex, and what we find is that they're undercover sometimes for a very long time. The sooner we can figure out any kind of tactic and technique and share that, the better protected, everybody is. But overall, I think the challenge is just awareness of, what's happening in their environments.
Yeah, can I add to that, if that's okay? So valid points, again, in complete agreement. And what we're seeing as far as actors, it's not just your nation states, of course. You've got the criminal contingents. Then you've got the nation states soliciting advice or buy-ins or how to access, hey, can I get into your telecom, right? Whether it's an employee, an insider threat, or whether it's something online that they can purchase on a forum or on Telegram or on Discord. And then furthermore, you've got front companies being set up to really blur and obfuscate the lines between nation state and criminal. And then those companies are further undetected because they can really manifest as legitimate. So there's all this information being sold and being exchanged on the criminal underground. And it's exactly as you said, we've got to exchange this information for protection and for defense. It's really, really important because everybody's taking a specialty, and there's so much ego in the criminal and the cyber actors, nation state too. I hit this telecom, I took off this chemical or this meat plant, right? So they really relish the fact that they've done it, and then people want to do that and do more and be just like that guy. So it's a fascinating circle that's just going to keep going.
Yeah, if the bad guys are sharing information, why aren't the good guys sharing information, right? Yeah.
Can I build on that too? So anyone in the room involved in the Costa Rica hack last year, or the mitigation of it? Anyone from the Conti group here? So I think that it's worth noting in particular, there were a few things about it that stood out, and I think it relates to the larger question of, small nations. April 2022, the first wave affected 27 different government bodies. It started with the Ministry of Finance. That affected the tax organization, the customs organization, and basically anyone in the private sector who was involved in export or import was affected. And then the second wave hit at the end of May and crippled the healthcare system. It was a hack of the Social Security entity that handled all the healthcare stuff. So direct effect. And so that was going on from early to mid-April all the way through the end of May. And I think the U.S. got involved, Spain got involved, people were providing assistance. The group behind the first wave of attacks was Conti Group. The second wave seemed to have the hacking software of Hive. There was some internecine things going on there. But one of the two things that stood out, this was the new president who had been elected, took office on May 8th, Costa Rica. The first thing he did was declare a national state of emergency. I think that's the first time a national state of emergency has been declared by a nation state over a cyber. He called it cyber terrorism and declared a state of emergency. And then when I think they were initially asking for $10 million, that they upped that to $20 million. I don't believe a ransom was paid when nothing was being paid out. Conti Group went public with some statements to say, encouraging the people of Costa Rica to rise up and overthrow their government. Which again, if this is all about the money, why are they getting into the politics? And Conti, of course, is a Russian group. It's been pro-Putin. It's been on record. So I would just point to this as an example of a broadening and blending of different objectives, which is exactly what I think puts it into the realm of more than just something that's a law enforcement problem. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember many years, before 9/11, before, even though we had the wake-up calls of the USS Cole bombing and the 1998 embassy bombings, there was a mentality in government of thinking about terrorism as law enforcement issues. The terrorists were more interested in publicity than bodies. Al-Qaeda turned that on its head, and then people began to realize. And so at some point, I think, looking at cyber, okay, North Korea was behind the Sony attack, but they just did that because they were mad about that movie. At some point, the US government and other governments are going to probably say, we can't just put this on the backs of individual companies, and I think they're already there, but I think more and more tools will be. And interestingly, I'll just close with this related to Costa Rica. That new bureau that I mentioned, the Cyberspace and Digital Policy Bureau, issued, they're just getting their feet on the ground for, they're doing the diplomacy stuff. They're just getting their feet on the ground for the mechanisms of providing security, foreign assistance. One of the first notices of funding opportunities that they issued was for support to Costa Rica. And CRDF Global, by the way, bid on it and won it. So, for better or worse, we're there. And I wish I could tell you more. If Chewy were here, he'd be able to tell you more about what that requirement is. But I suspect that it is not coincidental. I suspect that part of the decision to go for, supporting Costa Rica is, number one, they were attacked and they obviously have vulnerabilities and they're highly motivated and seized with it. And so I think it's a good move politically, but I'd like to see that replicated. Cyber Threat Alliance has been a big part of CDAC from the beginning. I wanted to mention that. And I just wanted to clarify that CDAC, is, the Center for the Cyber Defense Assistance Collaborative It's wonderful, but it's voluntary. And what we are trying to do as CRDF Global, as you know, with the CDAC initiative, is help our public funders figure out a way where they can invest in the kind of sustainable security assistance that takes advantage of all that capability and leverages it, but is not relying entirely upon the goodwill of private companies.
If I could, I'm obsessed with ransomware. It's how I got my start in cyber, working in Iranian ransomware campaign. And Jorge Mora was actually the former director of digital governments. He's who got Costa Rica with the president because, as you mentioned, he was newly elected. Jorge Mora's quote, which I literally take to me every panel, every appearance, is cybersecurity is a political, cultural, and business issue. We have to keep that going, keep beating that drum, because he's so very right. And furthermore, a lot of the insight that we, the hands-on practitioners, gained into Conti once they disbanded and had that whole explosion, if you will, was because of what was leaked from them, that Conti and other ransomware groups are in fact a business, recruiting, training, paying people, working at every single level, right? They have better communications than some of the groups that we've all mentioned do. And so we've got to get there. It's so incredibly essential. And also, that was a hybrid incident. That is not the first time that Russian actors did something in the digital space and said, hey, look over here. And then there was the physical aspect of, by the way, you should overthrow your country. They've done it in South America and other countries. They're doing it in Africa as well. And that's something that we really need to pay attention to. It's not just a digital conflict. It's not physical. It is a hybrid issue. And it really does take all of us in every industry, especially in a smaller nation that is understaffed, overwhelmed, and, flailing.
And Greg, weren't you in Costa Rica? Where's Greg? Who was here earlier?
So I think one of the questions that some of your comments begs, and I say this having spent most of my career either inside or working for foreign assistance groups, including U.S. Agency for International Development. I mean, I think that we can probably all agree that they are not the most robust, nimble organizations that exist. In disclosure, Tom and I were former colleagues. I mean, we've worked under awards where, we were planning literally years in advance for activities that could be conducted under a foreign assistance award. Given the nature of cyber threats and how quickly they come up and how quickly they require a response, what types of investments make sense that can, sort of adequately address threats, but also where we can stay ahead of those threats and not just be in a perpetual state of responding to them, as in the example of, sort of Costa Rica that you mentioned, Tom. And I'll let anybody who wants to go take this
well,
one.
I guess one of the best investments would be the Secure by Design initiative, right? Start building products that are secure from the ground up. Every month, how many patches are released every month? I mean, it's unsustainable, and it's not working. We need to do a better job of waiting to release software until it's thoroughly tested. Oftentimes software it gets released around a certain event, like RSA is coming up, we need to make a big announcement, Black Hat, what have you. And the software isn't always tested thoroughly enough that it should be released, that they're targeting an unrealistic roadmap based on a public event. So I think we need to be better about building software secure from the ground up. Just take the time and release it when it's ready to be released. I know that there's going to be accountability for platforms to help take the risk off the end user. When a vulnerability, especially a 0-day or a known vulnerability, is attacked, why is the end user the one that absorbs all the cost and all the pain? And it just doesn't even make sense. Certainly, this is going to take a long time to iron out responsibility and accountability, but it's a serious problem that does need to be looked at.
I couldn't agree with you more wholeheartedly. As AI is coming into the fold, we have the unique opportunity to take the lessons learned from traditional cybersecurity, the past 2 decades that we've all been through it, and start being proactive versus reactive. And that is one way to do that. And then furthermore, another conversation and theme that is echoed through this whole conference is really investing in education and starting younger. So Conti should be in middle schools from now on, right? Next year, start sandbox environments for these kids, show them what happens, show them how to push buttons, work with a MISP instance, get them exposed, go through, do a dry run. That's what I did in grad school, not to Conti. It was way older groups that I'm not going to date myself with, but get your hands on, live through actual incidents, what took down Sicker or took down a company, and start getting kids thinking about that so that they can then go out in the next generation and contribute to academia, government, industry, volunteer groups, all of it. There's no way that we can get ahead of it if we don't start with the youth and the next gen.
Yeah, and I would say that even younger students could be targets of capture the flag competitions, just tailor them for their age appropriate. But yeah, we give these students tablets and laptops, but we give them absolutely no training in cybersecurity whatsoever. The teachers aren't always positioned to help either. It's just plenty of accident waiting to happen.
I forget, I don't think this isn't the full one, but from the website, the Cyber Future Foundation's, this basic mission statement and vision statement is, I think it's probably something everybody in this group would agree with about trusted and innovation and so forth, and protection of privacy. But I just want to highlight, that is a political statement. As much as you think that there are nations in the world that do not view it that way, and not just China, Russia, North Korea, the ones that have been mentioned repeatedly. Authoritarian regimes, want to keep a bottleneck on information. So what I'm getting at is that, in answer to your question, Maggie, about what do countries need to do, I think that, cyber ransom groups operating, under a kind of, where the state authority is letting them operate, and turning a blind eye, like a mob, a political boss in a city that lets the mafia operate at the docks, and gets, I think that is, that's unsustainable. And I think that at some point, you start to treat it like we did piracy in the, on the Maghreb coast, in the 1800s, where community of nations come together and say, no more piracy, no more letters of marque, no more, state sanctioned predation. Because yes, we can do a lot more for defense. We can upgrade things, all of that. But as long as there are folks out there with refuges who can operate beyond the pale, everybody's a potential victim.
Okay, I'm getting the look from Val. So do we have enough time to have 30 seconds of closing comments from each? No? Okay. Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, we've got one addition to our panel for the next round. So you're stuck with us for another 45 minutes at least.
Well, thank you. So the U.S. just recently leveled up, and the Department of State now has an ambassador of cyber, Nate Fick. I got to meet him in Singapore at the International Cyber Week last fall. And now I think he's a staff of 30, and so that's great. We're a developed nation by most definitions, although other ethical ones you might think we're a little bit still behind. But I'm just curious, how many countries have a cyber ambassador? I know the Netherlands does. I know a couple other countries do. I'm just curious if that's a thing that we could advocate for and have, a United Nations of cyber.
It's a good idea. I don't know the answer of how many have actually designated it. And, Rob, Nate's predecessor before the cyber space and digital policy was affirmed as a bureau. There was that function being performed. There was a dispute in the Congress over whether that bureau should be under the econ, undersecretary, or the political it was that kind of stuff. So even I suspect in some nations there's probably an entity, performing some of those functions, even if they don't have the designated. But I do think it's a step in the right direction to have a designated bureau that has both the diplomatic effort, because what I was just talking about is basically establishing and enforcing norms of behavior among states. So that's very much of a diplomatic and policy, but that it also has the ability to fund initiatives and efforts that actually put meat on the bones of what the policy is supposed to do.
I too don't have an answer to that question, but it is a great idea. But I do want to highlight that if you want to look at a small country who does cybersecurity right, look at the Netherlands, because they used to be hammered with fraud and used and abused by all of our big four adversaries and more. And then in 2019, it was a complete 180, kicked them out, shut down the infrastructure, tightened their cybersecurity policies and standards, activated, in use. They were amazing. And all of those threat actors, most of the ones that I follow, have moved now to Asian infrastructure. So let the Netherlands be a shining example of a small nation doing it right. And I'll get you an answer to that question. Now I'm going to go look that up tonight. Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry.
So this is not a question, but an announcement. Jeanette has been nominated for a Cyber Scoop 50 award. So there's two reasons I'm telling you this. One is to congratulate her, of course. And the second is that you can Google Cyber Scoop 50 and vote for her.
That's totally embarrassing.
Thank you. That's especially meaningful because you announced that now, because Jeanette loves the spotlight. She loves everybody. You're never nervous at all about it.
Exactly.
So Jeanette and Michael Daniels is also from Cyber Threat Alliance, is also a nominee for one of the awards. So go and vote. Vote early and often.
So I had an observation as I was listening to the panel, right? What I heard was small nation, right? And what was computing in my head was small hospitals. Right, we had so many parallels to small business units. When I look at who's gotten breached, right, they're all talking about LLCs and LLPs and the smaller groups, right? So what lessons can be taken? And I think back to what the JSP, the Joint Security Project at HSCC said, if you're a small hospital, right, here are the threats. And here's what you can do with the limited resources you have, different than what large hospitals or medium-sized hospitals could do. And I wonder if that same approach might be effective. We've got a multi-state ISAC. It feels like we're ready for a multi-nation ISAC.
No, I agree with it. And I know that, for example, the U.S. Agency for International Development, my former employer, they're looking at models like that. And this is going to sort of scoop a little bit our humanitarian panel that is coming up as soon as Val yanks us off the stage. And I think that they're starting to experiment with models like that. So USAID has just in the last couple of months launched an ISAC in partnership with NetHope and Okta that is, sort of really intended to bring a lot of those, sort of tools and policies and expertise, to humanitarian actors. But I think that they're really playing around with sort of similar models at a regional level, from what I've seen. I don't know if anybody else has anything to say about that.
She's exactly right. I think you're right, where we start small with the ISACs and those communities. And then I'd also like to bring up the task forces, which need to be international and are getting there. So in 2022, the ransomware task force was set up. They just did a fabulous webinar. Please go and get that link. Hit me up on LinkedIn. I can give it to you. It was so informative. And then there's a dark web task force from 2023. And it's starting small with these exchanges. I heard someone mention B-sides yesterday. It's starting small and then continuing to grow. Group the Baltics together. They have have their plans. They work with the US and EUCOM, Group Latin America together, which has their intelligence sharing services. We'll get there internationally, but it does have to start small somewhere. And I think that's where we are now. And then we've got to cautiously grow and exchange and vet participants.
Okay. Any closing thoughts before we move to next panel?
I just have two comments. One is, the one thing we didn't touch on that is a huge problem cross nation is the policy and legal issues. It's really difficult to do takedowns, and we need to do more of these. And a lot of the challenge is sometimes that you can't legally work with law enforcement. It's just not easy to get that done. And we need to make that easier. We need to put the policies and laws in place where information can be exchanged timely, effectively, immediately, so we can do better at takedowns. But I also wanted to make one comment about CDAC. You know, when you can get a committed group of experts together to go and help a country, whether it's Ukraine or Estonia or whatever country it is that's under attack, that's pretty amazing. I like to look at CDAC as Doctor Across Borders for Cyber. Yeah.
So good.
Yeah. Geeks across borders.
Yeah, Geeks Across. I love that too. Yeah. Anyway, thanks.
Okay, well, thank you to this panel. And now I will move out of my moderator role into a panelist role. Let's switch seats.
Daniel, come on. All right. So this next panel is, again, I think in the relative term of things, it's going to be similar to the discussions that we have had. This panel focuses on the humanitarian mission and how to address that in a way that is timely, economical, sustainable. These three things are extremely crucial. On the CFF mission, the social impact item is extremely important, and we couldn't do this without economic consideration for the economics and sustainability in mind, right? And you heard Tom and Maggie talk about this from the CRDF, CDAC world, as well as the academic world that they're coming from. And most of that, we get very creative in finding solutions and opening avenues that didn't exist before to do this, but it doesn't have to be that way. So to curate this panel and continuing the discussion from the small, medium, or smaller countries to smaller but very impactful organizations, I'll invite in Catherine, if you want to come up here and drive this conversation. Yeah, just take over. And I think this is going to be a turn that discussion into the most humanitarian part of this, which Catherine, by the way, leads for us. And I cannot thank her enough, not just for bringing us here, but also, having that motivation to continue the mission, knowing that we will figure out the resources and economics of this later. So you're hearing from someone, and of course the panel, who are doing this on a daily basis, and love to get your thoughts on it. So
thanks, Val. And it's kind of timely that I'm going to parachute into this because I had a question that I was going to ask this panel, but I had to go to the washroom. I had the opportunity back, and I guess I'm going to kind of frame what you folks are going to talk about, but I had the opportunity back in March of this year to attend the International Mining Show in Toronto. It's massive. And one of the sessions I sat in wasn't cyber specific, but it related to cyber. And they were discussing access to minerals and resources in third world countries, emerging countries like Africa, in areas of South America. They talked about it from the economic development standpoint in terms of how it would bolster the country and provide that necessary to be able to grow. It was also resources that many other countries and large corporations wanted access to. So they were building the business case around it. But when they came to some of the impediments to getting at that resources, risk in cyber risk was noted in that panel. The second part of it, a discussion that kind of came, or a question I had for you folks, is really around economic recovery. And let's talk about Ukraine. We talk about cyber resilience and the importance of supporting Ukraine present state, whether it's from a government perspective, from industry and academia, and also from the citizens' perspective. There's no doubt that we need to do that. That's imperative. But it's also crucial to economic recovery, because if you talk to people like leaders like Kirill, while they're very focused on what's the events of the day hold, they're very focused on the future and that recovery. And cyber has an essential role to play in that. One of my first questions to you folks is going to be, I think everybody in this room could probably relate to the importance from an economic recovery and an economic development perspective that cyber has a role to play. But are we articulating that to the market from a humanitarian perspective so that governments and large industry and philanthropic are willing to make that donation? And I'm going to start with you, Tom.
Boy. Okay, you guys are going to be sick of hearing from me. So in some ways, when you think of certain kinds of humanitarian assistance, relief to a disaster or a war zone or food security, getting food, think supply chain. So everything that is cyber in supply chain relates to humanitarian operations. So that's one level. So you can disrupt critical resupply to an at-risk population through cyber means, as well as setting up roadblocks.
Yep.
So that's one thing. What I wanted to flag, which is probably less known to people, is the aspect of the role, particularly in conflicts and humanitarian disasters related to or caused by conflict, the role of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. The ICRC was born out of a 19th century agreement among European powers that, in fact, some things should be off limits. That we should limit warfare to uniformed combatants, that we should allow troops to collect their wounded, that we shouldn't bomb hospitals. You're familiar with the laws of war, and over time they've had additional protocols, and it's pretty well established. There's a movement afoot, an inquiry, and the ICRC has done a lot of work on this, and I'm not qualified to talk in detail about it, but there's been a lot of work to identify whether it makes sense to put the equivalent of the Red Cross, Red Crescent emblem onto, in a digital form, so that people who are operating as authorized non-combatant interlocutors, in the same way the ICRC will go and visit a prison camp to see how prisoners of war are being treated. And if they are not happy with the treatment, if it's not in, they don't go and publish it in the press. They talk to, they play that kind of ambassadorial role. And everybody, nation state armies agree with that. It's well established. Can you do something like that from a digital standpoint so that the access of people working in it? And so that's just one very specific. And then if the answer to that is yes, that's a good thing, then how and what, and how does it get recognized? And I think on that one, not to get you off track, but I think on that one, Donald has some particular interest. And also, just to remind you, Donald has not been introduced, and his background is worth hearing about.
And because I was going to go to Daniil next. Daniil Kermi is background includes World Economic Forum, very well respected policy and innovation leader worldwide. He's also on our board of advisors with CFF. And I was going to come to you next because, especially Daniil, in some of the conversations you've been involved at an international level, including World Economic Forum, is, especially from this humanitarian effort, is the importance of cyber resilience recognized as part of a humanitarian mission?
Thanks very much, and thanks for plugging. Absolutely. So, as a matter of fact, ICRC was just across the lake in Geneva for many, many years. But let me just unpack a little bit. When I think about nexus of humanitarian and cyber, there are really three ways to think about it. One is applicability of international humanitarian norms in cyberspace. Second is various unlawful activities that are facilitated by cyberspace that have humanitarian angle. Think about, scamming. You want to send something to Libya or Morocco, and it's end up in a bank account in Switzerland rather than in a mobile phone of the recipient. And the third way is the cybersecurity of the humanitarian actors themselves. And each one of those has a different way to think about it. But just a few statistics to throw it at you. If you think that other sectors are not prepared, the international humanitarian sector perhaps realizes the importance of it, but the decision there is very, very different. If you think about it, in many cases, humanitarian sector, you don't measure the impact of cyber attack in dollars, you measure it in lives. But then also your investment decision goes, okay, well, do I put so much resources into this program, or do I buy 100 more tents or 10,000 more meals? So the calculation is very different. As a matter of fact, there was a statistics there somewhere where about only a third of humanitarian actors actually have any sort of IT personnel, let alone CISOs. So it just gives you an idea. At the same time, as they started digitalizing and they understood the promise of tech, there was a very clear realization that, with opportunity comes the risks. And Thomas has mentioned, particularly ICRC has created this, what they call a cyber delegation, which is really a complete anomaly for them. It's a new, they normally, if you think about it, and I'm going to actually do something that my boss a long time ago told me never to do. He told me never answer the questions you were not asked, and I'm going to answer the question that somebody asked previously about how many tech envoys are there. And it's about 30 of them at the moment. But the interesting thing about it, if you think about it as well, is that they're designated as envoys, not necessarily as ambassadors, which is a step lower according to diplomatic and protocol. And that really goes to the heart of the challenge, because a lot of, as the cyber delegation of ICRC and as many governments, who are you representing to whom? Who are you discussing it with? And so it requires a little bit of a mental shift in terms of how international diplomacy and how international law is being deployed. But one thing that, and with this I will stop, one thing that I think is we really urgently need to start talking on collectively is that the fourth dimension that I haven't mentioned is applicability of all these norms when AI comes around. And I did mention to Tom that today we're very rapidly building AI capabilities. Some of it will be autonomous weapons. So think about it, they're being deployed as we speak, but the legal norm creation takes years. So even if in 5-10 years time, there will be an agreement of digitally designating non-combatant and so on, our AI systems that we're deploying today will not know that. So we'll have to retrain them, retool them, or deploy new ones. So this is becoming a little bit of an urgent task in my point of view. Thank you.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind adding a little bit of an answer to that question too. I think we have to, last year ICRC experienced one of the biggest data breaches that there has ever been in the humanitarian community. There is highly sensitive personal data for over 500,000 people that was hacked. From my point of view, this was sort of served as a seminal moment, at least for a lot of the big humanitarian response providers. And I think to Daniil's point of the impact being measured in lives, I think that that's something that was seen. In this case, it wasn't the absolute worst case scenario, but a lot of the data that was breached was around a family reunification program, where they were forced as a result of the data breach to switch back to sort of paper-based records or their Excel spreadsheets, where it literally set back their work months, if not years. And I think that ICRC, I think if they were here, what I would say to them is that I think they provided a shining example out of the humanitarian sector in terms of how they responded to it. They were totally open, totally transparent about the breach, how it happened, the steps that they're taking, the types of data that was compromised, and the things that they were putting in place to sort of prevent it happening again. But since then, they've also been leading the charge in the humanitarian sector in terms of establishing some type of data protection framework. And I think it's in recognition of the fact that they are dealing with, they're working in, conflict, highly complex environments, in dealing a lot of times with some of the world's most vulnerable people. And I think that recognition and then that subsequent data breach has a lot of that whole sector really rethinking and newly prioritizing cybersecurity and data protection as a result.
So we heard earlier today from Joe Sullivan, and who heads up Ukraine Friends. And let's face it, they are very fortunate in terms of having a leader who has a very extensive cyber background. So he's been able to bring that expertise into a lot of the different initiatives and way they're delivering that aid. But a lot of other organizations don't have that expertise. So Steph, I'm going to put you on the hot seat on this one and saying kind of what are some of the things that smaller humanitarian organizations should be thinking about in terms of building kind of some of those protectionism mechanisms?
That's a wonderful question. And having lived through 2 humanitarian efforts, right, being the fall of Afghanistan and then Ukraine, I don't know, but we have tried and we need to keep trying. I like the fact of trying to get ahead of AI to allow people to have, okay, this is going to pass through. There's going to be nothing that's going to interfere with these efforts, with this organization that's going to provide aid and help these people. However, look at Afghanistan as a recent example. We did that. When the Taliban took over, it started with veterans groups, grassroots efforts, sending cryptocurrency as well as fiat, right? Using Western Union, using all of those. And unfortunately, what happened was the Taliban, who used to be a fringe group, and when we were preparing for this panel, we said, well, what are we going to do about fringe groups? They're going to be there. There's really nothing you can do. There's always going to be a bad actor. Absolutely. But the Taliban went from a guerrilla fringe group to standing outside of those banks where people were sending money, closing them, killing the employees, and then the people who were waiting to get that money, taking their phones and devices, and if they saw WhatsApp, Signal, or Western Union app, killing those people as well. So then we changed to sending cryptocurrency. And the Taliban did the same thing that they did when I was first there in 2006, when instead of enabling the GSM infrastructure to have people talking, helping one another, avoid the war, let women and children out, they took down the GSM towers, and they did the exact same thing to the banking and to the cryptocurrency infrastructure and to the network. So what do we do? How do we do it? That's a recent example. I don't know. I would really love to continue that discussion for like the next rest of this week, actually.
And it's contrast that with the refugees fleeing Ukraine. So I was over in Poland in March and April of last year, and drove around through Romania, Slovakia, Hungary, to look at the border crossings and so on. And what really struck me was it was a smartphone refugee operation. Like the Knights of Malta in Hungary, who were kind of in overall charge of the border crossings, had QR codes at different stations that were identified as want to stay in Hungary or have a plan to go somewhere. And the Polish and Slovakian and other border crossings were similar in that it wasn't like the Syria or the South Sudan. That it was the first question that the volunteers had for the the folks exiting Ukraine was, do you have a plan? Is there a place where friends, family, somewhere you want to go in a European city? And if not, that's fine. Great. Here you can rest here, so on. But if you do, we're going to facilitate that. If you don't, we're going to work with you to identify it. And people who were, in transit for 24 or 36 hours actually had a lot of information by the time they got to the border crossing and the refugee, receiving areas. And then, to the great credit of all the European countries that have provided refuge, they had access to services, education, medical, and so based on a card, and the designation as a refugee.
Yeah.
And I think that was so dramatically different from other refugee situations that I've witnessed where, it's just mass and utter confusion, and you're just basic, if you can take care of the basic human necessities and not let cholera outbreak occur, you were doing great. In this one, I think we were, people were getting people to where they needed to go and could be really settled and safe for the duration, which, and that because we didn't have a Taliban blocking it.
And I think I shared the story with some folks over the last couple of days, but kind of CFF's foray into that humanitarian kind of response came in the kind of early weeks of the Taliban takeover. We were contacted by one of our CFF community members who's an appellate judge in West Florida, and she was part of an international organization that for women in law, so lawyers, judges. And at that point in time, female judges and lawyers in the Taliban were literally on the run, being hunted, trying to process their documentation to get out of the country via WhatsApp. She asked Val, of course, if there was something that we could do. He rallied the CFF community. We brought in Microsoft Philanthropic. In literally 10 days, we built together a customized platform, cloud-based, that would allow these women to destroy physical copies of their documentation, send it up to the cloud, and be able to process that documentation as long as they could get an internet connection safely and securely. So that was the power of the response of the industry when we're asked to come together. Is there, and I know I wasn't really in the discussions for your panel in advance, but is there other points from your perspective that you want to make sure the audience understands? Because one of the, you Tom, you do a very eloquent job of discussing, what the CDAC mission is about, which CFF is honored to be a part of. And that's the power of collaboration. A lot of these folks are doing that work right now without any monetary, but at some point in time to continue that work, there's a mission for funding. What should we be saying to the industry? What should we be saying to government leaders? And I'm going to put this to all of you in terms of the importance of that kind of collaboration, because in a lot of cases, it is a matter of life and death.
It's true, and that's, I guess, is the biggest problem, because there are different timelines. The humanitarian situation normally unravel in a very accelerated time frame. Businesses, to a certain extent, can step up to that timeline, although at a slower pace, I would say. By the time they process, by the time they think what they can do, should they do it or not do it, big various considerations. And then there's a government, and then there's international community. Again, as I was saying, the ideal situation where we reach an international agreement, it will take forever, and it will take many more humanitarian actions, probably by the time the agreement is reached. For the business side, I think that's a great example. If that's something that can be done, great, do it, do more of it. Jump on those opportunities.
I would just highlight the thing we haven't touched on. It's a little bit counterintuitive, because so much of what we talk about in terms of cybersecurity is better regulation, access, back all the things that require some level of intervention in what kind of began and took form, the internet, as a free-for-all. I would just like to highlight that there's a place for the dark web and Tor and places that are anonymous in support of humanitarian objectives. If you consider protection of, people at risk, in authoritarian regimes, a humanitarian objective. So protection, there's some demand in democracy and governance programs for, the kind of cyber knowledge that allows an opposition figure on the border with Myanmar, who's trying to do work that is under threat, or somebody in Taliban-controlled area, Afghanistan, to be able to operate, communicate without, easily being detected by, by state authorities or, or armed groups that would put their life at risk. And I think that's something that, again, just like you see sometimes, retired law enforcement people going to work for the international justice, mission that, protects, goes against human trafficking, and using all that law enforcement experience to help people at risk. I think there are, you see some people with really strong technical cyber understanding devoting themselves to, what would otherwise be a very far off and distant, a situation. And I mean, if you had an ideal world, we wouldn't be having this conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So before we completely make the internet, completely transparent and open, I would like us to, have a place of utopia where people aren't going to be, that there's no legitimate reason for people being able to stay anonymous.
I think that's a wonderful point about Tor and Telegram, because I've seen Iranians use that, Afghans, of course, it's on every continent. If you are a repressed population, or if you're living under an authoritarian government, you use Tor, or you use Telegram or something like that. And every time you're at a conference where there's someone there, like Black Hat always ends it with host a Tor node if you can. Please sign up to do it. Universities, industries. Now that is dicey because technically you can be held responsible for what exits your Tor node, but industry can get ahead of that, provide that information, a way to get out of those lockdown countries, provide those people a voice so that they're not lost. Because again, using the Taliban, but Iran does the same thing. They show the pictures or social media with, no, look at what the world's actually doing. Girls are going to school, they're educated, girls are working, and that's so far from the truth. So they're using the same platforms to misrepresent daily life. Let's get the actual story out there. The Philippines did it, the journalist that survived Duterte and being arrested, host that infrastructure, use Tor, and then send money some way or another so that they can supply themselves, feed themselves, and have those basic needs met. But you have to cater how you send the money to the specific area. There's no one size fits all.
So my view on this is, a lot of international funding organizations are notoriously risk averse. I also think that cybersecurity has made a lot of that risk aversion. It really sort of piques the nerves of all the lawyers, because I don't think I've seen any issue in the space of my career that, where the line between civilian and military is so blurred, or in the case of cyber, in some specific cases, where is the line between cyber defense and offensive cyber operations? And you'll see, Tom will remember, through some of the work in Ukraine when we worked together, I mean, every time it came up, it made the, USAID lawyers sweat bullets on anything that we're doing around cyber operations. So my message is that I think the private sector can sort of step up and take on some of that risk that funding organizations are so terrified of. And I think that, to me, initiatives like CDAC, that to me is really the niche that they fill, is being able to take on some of that stuff that funders aren't going to do. And to me, that is like one of the most important roles that the private sector can, sort of bring to humanitarian response efforts, sort of more broadly. The other thing that I will add is that I know that, sort of USAID and other global donors have been really bad in the past at putting together successful public-private partnerships. I think that for a long time, there was an idea that, just on the sort of do-gooder mission of the organization, that private sector partners would, open their pockets and their bank accounts no matter what, even if it was through, sort of corporate social responsibility platforms or budgets. I don't think that there was the understanding that even through CSR types of initiatives, it still has to align with the mission of the company that you're working with, right? The good thing is that I think USAID and others have gotten a lot better about this, and they're being a lot more deliberate and a lot more thoughtful about the best ways that the private sector can be involved. So my first message is that we look to the private sector to take on that risk. And the second thing is to sort of stay tuned, because I think it's going to get a lot better. And I think that the direction very, very broadly that it's heading is that the donor money is largely seen as a catalyzer fund for market-based interventions. And I think, to me, that has been a real shift in some of the donor policy that's happened even just in the last 5 years.
I'm going to ask you a question, because this came to, this was a comment made by Joe Sullivan a while ago, where he said, when we lose mindfulness and we're not getting that media traction and it's not front and center, the issue, you see a direct response in terms of the donation of money and how it comes in. And he talked about, the fact is, after Afghanistan and after a couple of months, then there was Ukraine, and you started to see that donation drop off. When the Afghan crisis first came out, I don't know if anybody has ever heard of Welcome US, but that was a response by three former sitting presidents, President Bush, Obama, and Clinton, and their spouses. And they had money rolling in. And there was a lot of front and center. And even on that front, they've had to kind of try to elevate the amount of getting it back in front of people. How important is the media? And you talked about misinformation stuff, because it's definitely an issue. How important is it to continue to communicate out the importance of the conflict, and let's use Ukraine as example, in getting that global attention from both a media perspective, but from a financial contributions perspective? And I'll start with you, Daniil, on that one.
Well, of course, it's extremely important, right? But at the same time, what I want to say is that long-term humanitarian efforts should not be driven by media cycles.
Mm-hmm.
And ICRC has been there since 1800s, and it's the most respectable organization is there. And their modus operandi is stay under the radar. We don't want any media attention. The moment you are in the media, you failed. So it's about setup of the organization. It's about what you really try to achieve, and how you really achieve those objectives.
Yeah, when I pay taxes every year, it's not because I got a nice note from the IRS. I just do it because I have to. And nation states act in their own interests. That can be a lot of dispute about what's the interest, but I think in the case of a place like Ukraine, the U.S., part of the reason why the U.S. Support has been so sustained, even though there's undercurrents there too, how much is enough and so forth, is partly because of the nature of the breach, yeah. But also because of a shared kind of longer term view that I think a lot of people have of democratic aspirations of countries, to set their own, destinies. That may be, that may be happening just as much in a Central African Republic that's not going to get the same kind of, support, simply because it's so remote and you don't have the same coverage. But I think that the sustainability of the kinds of things we're talking about, of digital resilience, among nation states and the populations of them, with a modicum of privacy and individual freedom to innovate, is really a long-term prospect that it really does deserve a level of repeated iteration. With each, you get tired of, oh yeah, there've been 1,000 ransomware attacks, what's one more? Well, actually taking the time to say, no, this one's different because it was the whole country and they got into political, that's what I mean.
Yep.
And I think that's the thing that people in this community are better able to do, because most of the world really that looks at the technology today and just says, I don't get it. Nothing's normal. So nothing really stands out. And I think it's when organizations like yours are saying, no, wait, this is a big moment. We need to focus on this because it indicates either something really good that we should support or something really bad that we need to nip in the bud.
I think the media can play an early role, but I fully agree that that is not sustained. That's not what they should be doing long term. So maybe the media can do the easy things for the people who are like, I don't understand tech. I don't know how to donate. I don't know how to send cryptocurrency. Do the roundup campaigns, do very, very simple things. But what we need to do is maybe highlight to the private sector, hey, Saudi Arabia is taking the humanitarian tact in Yemen, okay? And China is taking the humanitarian tact in Africa as well as Latin America. So do we want to be there? Rebuilding, providing, giving infrastructure, giving cell phones, giving education, shaping that? Or do you want China and Russia and other questionable societies shaping that? And maybe if that doesn't galvanize people, then I don't know, I give up.
Somebody mentioned to me last night that Huawei put the infrastructure in one African country, probably at a loss, but playing the long game on that. Daniil, you had a point?
But maybe after Maggie, I just wonder.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot to add other than that, sort of by mission and by definition, humanitarian organizations are impartial and nonpartisan. I mean, it's one of the basic tenets under international humanitarian law. So in that way, I don't think that the media plays a role on, whether there is, sort of food delivery to a region or not. I do think it does play other roles, in agreement with what everybody else has said here. And I think especially as at least the US government, and I think a lot more bi and multilateral funding organizations are doing now, sort of looking at the cycle of data as a much broader thing and getting into the dismiss malinformation space. I think it plays a big role there because I think, when we're looking at some of the examples there, and I think, sort of COVID was a really good example of this, sort of how, sort of disinformation in the news cycles can really, sort of hinder humanitarian service delivery, whether it's, sort of through, vaccinations or other types of prevention or information on how it spreads, or whether it even exists at all, or who's to blame for it, or all the craziness that we saw in the news cycles. So I do think that there are a lot of different ways that media can impact the humanitarian service delivery. I don't think it is, I don't think it impacts, or at least theoretically doesn't impact, whether a region or an individual or a country is a recipient of humanitarian assistance.
I just want to comment. I know Val is going to tell us to get off the stage, but just 20 seconds.
Such a nag.
I think the key here is that when we talk about humanitarian sector, there are absolutely universal human needs and rights, but the media landscape is extremely fragmented. It's very much jurisdiction by jurisdiction. I can guarantee you if tomorrow there's an asteroid hitting Earth, there will be a few jurisdictions on this planet that will never learn that happened, as was the case with COVID. So if you rely on media to drive your humanitarian operation, you are just a non-starter.
Absolutely. I will kind of wrap this so we can stay on schedule. I would encourage everyone, if you haven't talked to Tom or to Maggie or Steph about the CDAC mission, I strongly encourage you to. There is a potential to do many wonderful things, not only in Ukraine, but in other countries that we really do believe we can support. So Thank you very much, folks.
Vote Jeanette. Vote Jeanette Jarvis, cyberscoop.com.
So we'll take a quick 5-minute break to rearrange this place a little bit for the next mega panel. As we close out, that's going to be our closing panel. And then we'll start. Just give us 5 minutes to reset this place.